El sol de octubre en Guadalajara se alzaba como una promesa dorada sobre los techos de barro rojo del barrio de Tlaquepaque, donde Roberto Mendoza había vivido toda su vida. A sus 62 años, sus manos curtidas por 4 décadas trabajando como maestro carpintero todavía temblaban ligeramente mientras ajustaba el nudo de la corbata azul marino que Esperanza, su difunta esposa, le había regalado para su 25º aniversario de bodas. Hoy era el día de la boda de Paloma, su única hija, y Roberto sentía el peso de la ausencia de Esperanza como una piedra en el pecho. 3 años habían pasado desde que el cáncer se la llevó. Pero en momentos como este, la falta de su risa cristalina y sus consejos sabios se sentía tan fresca como una herida abierta. «Papá, ¿estás listo?». La voz de Paloma flotó desde el pasillo de su casa de adobe, la misma casa donde ella había crecido, donde había aprendido a caminar sosteniendo los dedos callosos de Roberto, donde había llorado sus primeras desilusiones amorosas en el regazo de su madre. Roberto se miró una vez más en el espejo del armario que había construido con sus propias manos 30 años atrás. Su cabello gris estaba perfectamente peinado hacia atrás, su bigote recortado con precisión, y sus ojos café oscuro brillaban con una mezcla de orgullo paternal y melancolía profunda. El traje negro que había mandado hacer especialmente para esta ocasión le quedaba perfecto, aunque había perdido peso desde la muerte de Esperanza, y a veces se sentía como si estuviera habitando la ropa de otro hombre. «Ya voy, mi niña», respondió, su voz ronca por la emoción contenida. Cuando abrió la puerta de su recámara, Roberto se quedó sin aliento. Paloma estaba parada en el pasillo, envuelta en el vestido de novia de su bisabuela materna, que habían modificado durante meses. El encaje de chantilly, amarillento por los años, pero aún elegante, se ajustaba perfectamente a su figura esbelta. Su cabello negro azabache, idéntico al que Esperanza había tenido a los 25 años, estaba recogido en un chongo elegante adornado con las perlas que Roberto le había regalado para su quinceañera. «¿Cómo me veo, papá?». Paloma sonrió, pero Roberto pudo ver la nerviosidad que bailaba en sus ojos verdes, los únicos que había heredado de él en lugar de los café oscuro de la familia materna. «Te ves como tu madre el día de nuestra boda», Roberto dijo, su voz quebrándose ligeramente. «La mujer más hermosa que he visto en mi vida». Paloma se acercó y ajustó la corbata de Roberto con manos temblorosas. A los 28 años había heredado no solo la belleza de Esperanza, sino también su fortaleza interior y su tendencia a preocuparse por todos antes que por sí misma. Durante los 3 años desde la muerte de su madre, Paloma había sido quien cuidaba a Roberto, quien se aseguraba de que comiera bien, quien lo acompañaba a misa los domingos, quien gradualmente había llenado el vacío que Esperanza había dejado en la rutina diaria de Roberto. «Papá, ¿crees que mamá estaría orgullosa?», preguntó Paloma, sus ojos llenándose de lágrimas que se esforzaba por contener para no arruinar su maquillaje. Roberto tomó las manos de su hija entre las suyas, sintiendo la suavidad de su piel contrastando con la rugosidad de sus palmas marcadas por años de trabajo con madera. «Tu madre está aquí con nosotros hoy, mi amor. La siento en cada sonrisa tuya, en cada gesto de bondad. Está tan orgullosa que debe estar haciendo que todos los ángeles del cielo voltean a verte». La casa se había transformado durante las últimas semanas en un centro de actividad frenética. Las tías de Paloma habían llegado desde Michoacán y Puebla, llenando cada rincón con el aroma de mole poblano, pozole rojo y chiles en nogada que habían estado preparando desde las 5 de la madrugada. El patio trasero, que Roberto había expandido y embellecido durante meses. Estaba decorado with papel picado de colores que danzaba suavemente en la brisa matutina y mesas largas cubiertas con manteles de lino blanco que había bordado la prima de Esperanza. El sonido de mariachis afinando sus instrumentos en la calle creaba una banda sonora festiva que contrastaba con la ansiedad que Roberto sentía creciendo en su estómago. No era nerviosismo por la ceremonia en sí, sino algo más profundo y difícil de definir relacionado con Diego Herrera, el novio de Paloma. Roberto había conocido a Diego hacía 2 años, cuando Paloma lo trajo por primera vez a la casa familiar para la cena dominical. Diego era arquitecto, graduado del Tecnológico de Monterrey, proveniente de una familia acomodada de la zona rosa de Guadalajara. A los 32 años, tenía la confianza pulida de alguien que había crecido con ventajas que Roberto nunca había podido darle a su hija y una forma de hablar que sugería educación privilegiada y expectativas altas. La primera impresión había sido positiva. Diego era educado, articulado y claramente enamorado de Paloma. Hablaba con conocimiento sobre arquitectura colonial mexicana. Mostraba interés genuino en el trabajo de carpintería de Roberto y trataba a Paloma con una cortesía que Roberto había apreciado. Pero con el tiempo, Roberto había comenzado a notar detalles que lo inquietaban. Diego tenía una forma sutil de corregir a Paloma cuando ella hablaba de su trabajo como maestra de primaria en la escuela del barrio, como si su profesión fuera menos importante que la de él. Roberto había observado cómo Diego cambiaba la conversación cuando Paloma mencionaba sus estudiantes o los desafíos de enseñar en una comunidad de bajos recursos, dirigiendo la atención hacia sus propios proyectos arquitectónicos y clientes corporativos. Más preocupante aún era la forma en que Diego interactuaba con el entorno social de Roberto. Durante las cenas familiares, Roberto había notado cómo Diego se sentaba ligeramente apartado del grupo, como si mantuviera una distancia invisible entre él y la familia extendida de Paloma. Sus sonrisas parecían calculadas, sus risas un poco demasiado forzadas, y sus preguntas sobre la familia y las tradiciones locales tenían la calidad de alguien estudiando una cultura extraña en lugar de participando genuinamente en ella. «Roberto, ¿estás bien?». La voz de su cuñada Elena lo sacó de sus pensamientos. Elena había sido la hermana mayor de Esperanza y había asumido un papel maternal con Paloma después de la muerte de su hermana. «Sí, Elena, solo pensando». Elena, una mujer robusta de 58 años, con el cabello teñido de castaño claro y manos siempre ocupadas, se acercó a Roberto con la expresión preocupada que había perfeccionado durante décadas de ser la consejera no oficial de la familia. «¿Pensando en qué? Roberto, conozco esa cara. Es la misma que ponías cuando Esperanza estaba embarazada de Paloma y te preocupabas por si serías buen padre». Roberto sonrió, a pesar de su inquietud. Elena tenía la habilidad molesta, pero efectiva, de leer sus emociones como si fueran titulares de periódico. «Es Diego», admitió Roberto, bajando la voz mientras observaban a Paloma recibir los últimos toques de maquillaje de su prima Sofía. «Hay algo sobre él que no puedo identificar, pero que me hace sentir incómodo». Elena siguió la mirada de Roberto hacia donde Diego estaba en el patio, dirigiendo a los músicos con gestos amplios y hablando por teléfono celular de manera animada. Incluso desde la distancia, su lenguaje corporal transmitía autoridad y control. «¿Qué tipo de incomodidad?», Elena preguntó, su tono volviéndose más serio. «La forma en que habla de Paloma cuando ella no está presente, como si fuera un proyecto, algo que está mejorando o refinando». Roberto pausó, buscando las palabras correctas. «Y la forma en que habla sobre nuestra familia, nuestras tradiciones, Con respeto, sí, pero el tipo de respeto que se le muestra a algo quaint, algo pintoresco, pero inferior. Elena asintió lentamente, su expresión indicando que había notado patrones similares. Roberto, ¿le has dicho algo de esto a Paloma? ¿Cómo podría? Está enamorada, Elena. La he visto más feliz en estos 2 años que en cualquier momento desde que murió su madre. Diego la hace reír, la apoya en su carrera y claramente puede darle una vida más confortable de la que yo nunca pude proporcionarle. Pero tengo la sensación de que Diego se está casando con la versión de Paloma que él quiere que sea, no con la mujer que realmente es. Elena permaneció en silencio por un momento, observando la actividad frenética de la preparación de la boda. El patio se había llenado de familiares y amigos, todos vestidos con sus mejores galas, los hombres con guayaberas almidonadas y pantalones de vestir, las mujeres con vestidos coloridos y zapatos nuevos que ya les estaban causando molestias. «Roberto», Elena dijo finalmente, «¿recuerdas lo que Esperanza solía decir sobre los matrimonios?» Roberto sonrió, recordando la sabiduría práctica de su esposa. Que un matrimonio bueno requiere 2 personas que se enamoren de quien realmente es el otro, no de quien podrían llegar a ser. Exacto. Y también decía que los padres tienen que aprender cuándo guardar silencio y confiar en que criaron a sus hijos para tomar buenas decisiones. La verdad en las palabras de Elena era incontestable, pero no aliviaba la ansiedad que Roberto sentía creciendo en su pecho. Había criado a Paloma para ser independiente, inteligente y capaz de juzgar el carácter de las personas. Si ella había elegido a Diego, debía tener razones que Roberto no podía ver o entender. El sonido de automóviles llegando interrumpió sus pensamientos. A través de la ventana, Roberto vio los Mercedes-Benz y BMW de la familia Herrera estacionándose en la calle, contrastando marcadamente con los Tsuru, Jetta y camionetas pick-up que pertenecían a la familia y amigos de Roberto. Los padres de Diego, Mauricio y Cristina Herrera emergieron del Mercedes negro con la elegancia contenida de personas acostumbradas a ser las más sofisticadas en cualquier reunión. Mauricio, un abogado corporativo exitoso, vestía un traje italiano que probablemente costaba más que el salario mensual de Roberto. Cristina, una mujer delgada con cirugía plástica evidente y joyas que capturaban la luz del sol, se movía con la gracia calculada de alguien acostumbrada a ser observada y admirada. Roberto los había conocido solo 3 veces antes de hoy, y cada encuentro había reforzado su sensación de que existía un abismo cultural entre las 2 familias que iba más allá de las diferencias económicas. Los Herrera eran corteses pero distantes, educados pero con una frialdad que sugería que consideraban la boda de su hijo como algo que había que tolerar en lugar de celebrar. «Ahí vienen los otros padres», Elena murmuró, su tono llevando una nota de diversión maliciosa. «¿Estás listo para otra conversación sobre los beneficios de vivir en las lomas versus Tlaquepaque?» Roberto rió a pesar de su nerviosismo. Durante la cena de ensayo la noche anterior, Cristina Herrera había pasado 20 minutos explicándole a Elena las ventajas de las escuelas privadas sobre las públicas, aparentemente sin darse cuenta de que Elena había sido directora de escuela primaria pública durante 30 años. «Paloma, mi amor», Roberto llamó a su hija, quien estaba recibiendo bendiciones de sus abuelas maternas. «Ya llegaron los padres de Diego». Paloma se acercó, su vestido susurrando contra el piso de Talavera que Roberto había instalado personalmente 5 años atrás. Su sonrisa era radiante, pero Roberto pudo ver las pequeñas líneas de tensión alrededor de sus ojos que aparecían cuando estaba tratando de manejar múltiples presiones simultáneamente. ¿Cómo me siento el vestido?, preguntó, girando ligeramente para mostrar el trabajo de alteración que habían hecho. Perfecto, mija. Te ves como una princesa azteca. Paloma rió, el sonido llevando la alegría genuina que Roberto amaba más que cualquier otra cosa en el mundo. Papá, las princesas aztecas no usaban vestidos de novia europeos. Bueno, entonces eres la primera, creando nuevas tradiciones. El comentario hizo que Paloma pausara, su expresión volviéndose momentáneamente pensativa. Roberto se preguntó si había tocado algo sensible, alguna conversación que ella había tenido con Diego sobre tradiciones, family customs o las diferencias entre sus backgrounds. Antes de que pudiera preguntar, Diego apareció en la puerta del patio, su presencia inmediatamente cambiando la dinámica del espacio. Alto y delgado, con cabello negro perfectamente peinado y una sonrisa que revelaba dientes blancos perfectos, Diego tenía el tipo de apariencia que las cámaras amaban y que las madres de novias envidiaban para sus hijas. «Mi amor», Diego dijo, acercándose a Paloma, pero deteniéndose justo antes de abrazarla, claramente consciente de no arrugar su vestido o descomponer su maquillaje. «Te ves absolutamente stunning». Roberto notó que Diego había usado la palabra en inglés en lugar de hermosa o preciosa, un detalle pequeño pero indicativo de patrones más grandes en su forma de comunicarse. Era como si el español no fuera suficientemente sofisticado para expresar sus sentimientos genuinos. «Diego, ¿cómo te sientes?», Roberto preguntó, extendiendo su mano para el tipo de handshake firme que había aprendido en décadas de tratar con contratistas y clientes. Diego aceptó el apretón de manos con una sonrisa que no alcanzaba completamente sus ojos. Nervioso pero emocionado, Roberto, listo para hacer de Paloma la mujer más feliz del mundo. La frase sonaba ensayada, como algo que Diego había dicho múltiples veces durante los últimos meses. Roberto se preguntó si Diego realmente entendía lo que significaba hacer feliz a Paloma, o si estaba operating from a template genérico de comportamiento de novio ideal. «¿Y tus padres? ¿Cómo están?» «Muy bien. Mamá está un poco preocupada por el weather. Says it might rain later, but everything looks perfect». Roberto miró hacia el cielo, donde las nubes blancas se movían perezosamente contra el azul perfecto del cielo tapatío. No había indicación de lluvia, pero entendió que Cristina Herrera probablemente estaba buscando algo por lo cual preocuparse, alguna imperfección en el día que confirmaría sus reservas sobre la boda. La conversación fue interrumpida por la llegada del mariachi principal, un hombre mayor con bigote gris y traje de charro tradicional que Roberto había contratado después de semanas de research y comparación de precios. Los mariachis eran una tradición que Roberto no estaba dispuesto a comprometer, sin importar el costo. «Don Roberto», el mariachi dijo, quitándose su sombrero con respeto, «estamos listos para comenzar cuando usted diga». Roberto sintió una oleada de orgullo y emoción. Durante meses había planeado cada detalle de este día, trabajando horas extra en su carpintería para poder pagar los músicos, las flores, la comida y todos los elementos que harían de la boda de Paloma un día memorable. No tenía el presupuesto de la familia Herrera, pero tenía amor, tradition y la determinación de darle a su hija una celebración digna de los sueños que Esperanza había tenido para su única hija. «En 15 minutos», Roberto respondió. «Primero queremos tomar algunas fotografías familiares». El fotógrafo, un joven talentoso del barrio, a quien Roberto había visto crecer desde niño, ya estaba organizando a la familia extendida para las fotos tradicionales. Roberto observó a Diego interactuando con los tíos, primos y amigos de la familia, notando cómo su sonrisa se mantenía perfecta, pero su lenguaje corporal sugería impaciencia por completar las obligaciones sociales y proceder con los aspectos más formales de la ceremonia. Cuando llegó el momento de la foto padre-hija, Roberto sintió que su corazón se expandía y se rompía simultáneamente. Paloma se acercó a él con la gracia natural que había heredado de Esperanza, y cuando puso su brazo alrededor de la cintura de Roberto, él pudo oler el perfume que había sido el favorito de su madre. ¿Estás feliz, mija?, Roberto preguntó en voz baja, mientras el fotógrafo ajustaba su lente. Más feliz de lo que pensé que era posible después de que perdimos a mamá, Paloma respondió, su voz llevando una sinceridad que calmó algunas de las preocupaciones de Roberto. Pero mientras posaban para la cámara, Roberto notó que Diego estaba parado ligeramente apartado del grupo, checking his phone y conversando en voz baja con su padrino. No era unusual para un novio estar nervioso antes de la ceremonia, pero algo en la forma en que Diego evitaba el contacto visual con Roberto le dio una sensación de unís que no pudo sacudirse. La ceremonia civil tendría lugar en el patio trasero, seguida por una recepción que Roberto esperaba duraría hasta las primeras horas de la madrugada. Había contratado al mejor cocinero del barrio. Había asegurado que hubiera suficiente tequila y cerveza para celebrar apropiadamente, y había even arranged para que hubiera fuegos artificiales al final de la noche. Todo estaba perfecto. Todo excepto la feeling persistente de que algo fundamental estaba wrong, algo que Roberto no podía identificar, pero que grew stronger cada vez que observaba la interacción entre Diego y los elementos más auténticos y tradicionales de la celebración. Mientras los invitados comenzaban a tomar sus lugares para la ceremonia, Roberto ofreció su brazo a Paloma para escoltarla hacia el altar que había construido personalmente, decorado con flores de cempasúchil y rosas blancas que Esperanza había amado. ¿Lista, princesa? Lista, papá. Pero mientras caminaban hacia el comienzo de la nueva vida de Paloma, Roberto no podía sacudirse la sensación de que estaba entregando a su hija preciosa a un hombre que nunca la entendería completamente, y que el día más hermoso de sus vidas podría ser también el comienzo del final de la relación íntima que él y Paloma habían compartido durante 28 años. Lo que Roberto no sabía era que sus instincts estaban más correctos de lo que había imaginado, y que en las próximas horas la máscara de cortesía de Diego se resquebrajaría de maneras que revelarían verdades sobre su carácter que cambiarían todo para siempre. La ceremonia civil había transcurrido con la solemnidad apropiada bajo el cielo azul perfecto de Guadalajara. Roberto había caminado a Paloma por el pasillo improvisado entre las sillas plegables que había rentado, sintiendo cada paso como una mezcla de orgullo infinito y pérdida profunda. Cuando entregó la mano de su hija a Diego ante el juez civil, Roberto había susurrado, «Cuídala como yo la cuidé», y Diego había respondido con un asentimiento que parecía sincero, pero que no alcanzaba completamente sus ojos. Ahora, 2 horas después, la recepción estaba en full swing. Los mariachis habían tocado Las Mañanitas, Cielito Lindo y todas las canciones tradicionales que Roberto había solicitado específicamente. El mole poblano de su cuñada Elena había sido declarado el mejor que había probado por varios invitados, e incluso algunos miembros de la familia Herrera habían expresado genuina apreciación por la comida auténtica. Roberto estaba parado cerca de las mesas de comida, observando a Paloma bailar con Diego al son de «Sabor a mí», cuando sintió una mano en su hombro. Se volvió para encontrar a Mauricio Herrera, el padre de Diego, sosteniendo 2 copas de tequila herradura que Roberto había selected especialmente para la ocasión. «Roberto, quería hablar contigo privately», Mauricio dijo, su tono formal pero non-friendly. ¿Podemos caminar un poco? Roberto aceptó la copa de tequila y siguió a Mauricio hacia una esquina más quieta del patio, donde el sonido de los mariachis se mezclaba con las conversaciones animadas de los invitados. Mauricio era un hombre impresionante, aunque shorter que Roberto, con cabello gris plateado perfectamente styled y la postura confident de alguien acostumbrado a commanding attention en boardrooms corporativos. «Es una boda hermosa», Mauricio comenzó, alzando su copa en un brindis informal. «Paloma se ve radiante». «Gracias, Mauricio. Ha sido un día perfecto». Roberto brindó con él, noting que Mauricio había pronunciado el nombre de Paloma con el slight accent que suggested that Spanish wasn't his primary language of thought, despite being perfectly fluent. Roberto quería aprovechar esta oportunidad para discutir el future de nuestros hijos. Roberto sintió que su stomach tightened slightly. Había sido expecting esta conversación, pero hoping que podría be avoided until after la luna de miel. ¿Qué tienes en mente? Mauricio tomó un sip de su tequila, clearly organizing his thoughts carefully. Diego tiene una oportunidad increíble en su firma, un proyecto en Dubái que podría establish him como uno de los arquitectos más promising de Latinoamérica. Es una chance que no puede rechazar. Roberto waited, sensing que había more coming. El proyecto requiere que él y Paloma se muden a Dubái por al menos 3 años, posiblemente 5. Las palabras hit Roberto como un physical blow. 3 años, posible 5. Su hija, su única family remaining desde la muerte de Esperanza, living in a country tan distant que las llamadas telefónicas serían complicated por time zones y cultural barriers. ¿Y Paloma qué opina de esto? Roberto preguntó, though él already suspected la respuesta based on el fact de que esta conversación was happening sin Paloma present. Bueno, Diego quería discuss it contigo primero por respeto. Wanted to make sure que you understood la magnitud de esta oportunidad para su carrera. Roberto observó a Paloma across el patio, still dancing con Diego, her face glowing con happiness que parecía genuine y complete. Ella no sabía about Dubai. Esta conversation was happening over her head, about her future, sin her input. Mauricio, con todo respeto, esto es algo que Diego debería discutir con Paloma, no conmigo. Of course, pero you understand, como padres, sometimes we need to help nuestros hijos see el big picture. Paloma is young, está confortable aquí en Guadalajara. Might not initially appreciate la incredible opportunity que esto represents. Roberto felt anger beginning to simmer en su chest. La implication was clear. Paloma era demasiado naive, demasiado provincial, demasiado limited en su perspective para understand lo que was best para su own future. Paloma es maestra, Mauricio, ama su trabajo, tiene students que depend on her, colleagues que la respect. No es solamente about comfort, es about purpose. Mauricio's smile became slightly condescending. Roberto, por favor understand, en Dubai, Paloma podría teach at international schools que pay 5 times lo que earn aquí. Could travel, experience different cultures, broaden her horizons significantly. ¿Y si ella no wants esos horizons broadened? ¿Y si está happy con la vida que has built aquí? La pregunta hung en el air between ellos. Roberto could see que Mauricio was struggling to understand how someone could prefer la simplicidad de Tlaquepaque over la sofisticación de Dubai, how una maestra de escuela pública could find more fulfillment en su classroom local than en una international school que paid exponentially more. Roberto, I think you're underestimating tu hija. She's intelligent, adaptable. And con time, she'll come to appreciate. What I appreciate, Roberto interrupted, su voice carrying more edge than había intended, es que mi hija is an adult capable of making her own decisions about her life. If Diego wants to move to Dubai, that's a conversation él needs to have con ella, not con su father. Mauricio's expression shifted slightly, revealing a flash of irritation que he quickly suppressed. Por supuesto. I just thought, padre a padre, we could discuss how best to support their decision. Their decision, or Diego's decision. Before Mauricio could respond, Roberto saw something across el patio que made his blood freeze. Diego estaba pulling out una silla from una mesa where several elderly aunts estaban seated, clearly preparing to sit down. Roberto's tía, Esperanza, 83 years old, y slightly unsteady on her feet después de hip surgery el año pasado, was walking toward esa misma chair. Roberto called out, "Tía, cuidado," pero su voice was lost in el sound de mariachis y conversation. What happened next unfolded in horrible slow motion. As Tía Esperanza began to lower herself toward la silla, Diego suddenly jerked it away, clearly intending to sit down himself, sin-checking si anyone else needed la chair. Tía Esperanza, caught off balance and with no support, fell backward. But Roberto had been moving toward them desde el momento que vio la situation developing. He lunged forward, trying to catch his aunt, pero en su urgency, he misjudged la distance. Instead of catching Tía Esperanza, Roberto collided con ella, and both of them crashed to el ground in un tangle of arms and legs y wedding attire. El patio fell silent. Los mariachis stopped playing. Every conversation ceased. Roberto lay on el ground con his 83-year-old aunt on top of him, both of them covered in dust, clearly shaken. His carefully pressed traje was torn at el knee, y Tía Esperanza's elegant vestido azul was stained con dirt from el patio. Diego stood frozen, still holding la chair, su face una mask of shock y embarrassment. Around them, dozens of family members and friends stared in stunned silence, trying to process what they had witnessed. Roberto carefully helped Tía Esperanza to her feet, checking for injuries while maintaining su dignity despite la humiliation burning in his cheeks. "¿Estás bien, tía?" he asked, his voice gentle despite his rage. "Sí, mijo, estoy bien. Just a little startled," she responded, though Roberto could see she was shaking. It was Elena quien broke el silence, moving quickly to help both Roberto y Tía Esperanza while shooting a look of pure fury at Diego. "¿Pero qué pasó aquí?" Roberto looked directly at Diego, who was still standing there con la silla in his hands, clearly struggling to find words. "I think," Roberto said, his voice carrying clearly across el patio silencioso, "que fue un accident." But every person in that patio knew it wasn't entirely an accident. They had witnessed Diego's carelessness, his assumption que he could take whatever chair he wanted, sin consideration para others, especially elderly family members who needed support and assistance. Paloma rushed to her father's side, her white dress trailing in el dust. "Papá, ¿estás lastimado?" "I'm fine, mija." Just concerned about Tía Esperanza. Paloma helped dust off Roberto's jacket while shooting confused glances at Diego, clearly trying to understand what had happened. "Diego, ¿qué pasó?" Diego finally found his voice, though it came out unsteady, why defensive. I didn't see. It was an accident, Paloma. I didn't realize que tu tía was..." He didn't finish la sentence, pero everyone could fill on los blanks. He didn't realize, porque he hadn't been paying attention. Hadn't been considering que other people might need la share más than he did. Roberto stood up, accepting Elena's help and brushing dust from his traje. Around them, el patio gradually returned to life, conversations resuming in hushed tones, pero with an undercurrent of tension que hadn't existed before. Los mariachis began playing again, but más softly, as si they sensed que la mood había shifted fundamentally. "Perhaps we should continue la celebración," Roberto said, trying to restore normalcy para Paloma's sake, más than anything else. "Tía Esperanza está bien. I'm fine." It's still our beautiful Paloma's wedding day. But as guests slowly returned to their conversations, the activities, Roberto noticed how many of them were now watching Diego con different eyes. La incident había revealed something about Diego's character, his self-centeredness, his lack of awareness of others, su tendency to assume que his needs took priority over everyone else's. Más troubling para Roberto was how Diego handled LA aftermath. Instead of approaching Tia Esperanza directly to apologize, instead of showing genuine concern about whether she had been hurt, Diego spent the next 20 minutes talking to his own family members, clearly spinning la narrative para minimize his responsibility. Roberto overheard fragments of Diego's explanation to his father. The old woman moved too slowly. I didn't expect her to try to sit there. It was crowded, confusing. Each excuse made Roberto's anger grow. Tia Esperanza wasn't the old woman. She was Paloma's great-aunt, a beloved family matriarch. Quien had helped raise Paloma después de Esperanza's death. She deserved respect, consideration, y genuine concern para her well-being, not dismissive explanations que treated her como an inconvenience. When Diego finally approached Roberto, his apology was perfectly worded, pero somehow hollow. Roberto, I am so sorry about what happened. It was completely unintentional. I hope Tia wasn't hurt. She's fine, Diego, but perhaps más careful attention next time would prevent similar accidents. Diego's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the gentle but pointed criticism. Of course, there was so much going on, so many people. Roberto studied Diego's face, noting how his eyes didn't quite meet Roberto's gaze. In his 40 years of experience dealing with contractors, clients, business partners, Roberto had learned to read people's sincerity through their body language, más than their words. Diego's apology carried all the right phrases, pero lacked the genuine remorse que would have made it meaningful. Diego, Roberto said quietly, in mi family, we take care of los mayores. They have priority for chairs, for food, para attention. Es una tradición que we value. I understand completely, Roberto. In my family también, we respect our elders. But even as Diego said the words, Roberto could see que he didn't truly comprehend what had happened. Para Diego, Esther had been an unfortunate accident, an embarrassing moment que needed to be smoothed over con proper apologies, then forgotten. He didn't grasp que, for Roberto's family, Diego's behavior had revealed something fundamental about his character and values. Paloma approached them, having changed into her reception dress, una elegant numero in white silk que Elena había helped her select months ago. She looked concerned, pero was clearly trying to maintain la festive mood para todos los invitados. ¿Todo está bien?" she asked, looking between Roberto y Diego. "Perfectly fine, mi amor," Diego said, immediately putting his arm around Paloma's waist and pulling her close. "Just an unfortunate accident, pero everyone está bien." Roberto watched Paloma's face as Diego explained what had happened, noting how she listened with growing concern. When Diego finished, she turned to Roberto with questions in her eyes. "Papa, Tia Esperanza está really okay?" "She's fine, mija, a little shaken, pero no injuries." But Roberto could see que Paloma was processing more than just the physical aftermath of Ella incident. She had known Tia Esperanza her entire life, understood how frail the elderly woman had become since her hip surgery. He could imagine how frightening it must have been para her to lose her balance so suddenly. "Diego," Paloma said, her voice carrying a note que Roberto had rarely heard from her, disappointment mixed con something que might have been emerging awareness. "Tia Esperanza has trouble getting around since her operation. You have to be careful around her." I know. I feel terrible about it. I'll make sure to apologize to her properly." But as Roberto watched Diego durante los next 30 minutes, he noticed que while Diego talked about apologizing to Tia Esperanza, he never actually did it. Instead, he kept himself surrounded by his own family members, while college friends, carefully avoiding the areas of El Patio where Los Mayores were seated. La incident had created an invisible divide on la celebration. Roberto's family members, los tíos, tías, primos, y long-time neighbors, continued to be polite to Diego, pero with a coolness que hadn't existed before. They had witnessed not just his carelessness, but his response to it. Their collective judgment was clear, though unspoken. Meanwhile, Diego's family y friends seemed either unaware of la significance de lo que había pasado, or actively trying to minimize it. Roberto overheard Cristina Herrera telling someone, "These old people need to be more careful at crowded events. It's dangerous para them to be moving around so much." La comment made Roberto's blood pressure spike. Tia Esperanza hadn't been moving around. She had been carefully, slowly trying to sit en una chair that Diego had pulled away from her, sin warning a consideration. As la afternoon progressed into evening, Roberto noticed other small incidents that reinforced his growing concerns about Diego's character. When Los Mariachis began playing traditional songs that invited group participation, Diego remained seated, checking his phone instead of joining the cultural celebration that was so important to Paloma's family. When Tia Esperanza's granddaughter, a shy 10-year-old named Sofia, approached the newlyweds' table with a handmade card she had created para Paloma, Diego barely glanced at it before returning his attention to a conversation with his college roommate about investment opportunities on real estate. Paloma, in contrast, spent 15 minutes con little Sofia, examining every detail of la card, asking questions about the drawings, making the child feel like her gift was the most precious thing she had received all day. Roberto watched these interactions with growing clarity about the fundamental differences between his daughter and her new husband. Paloma had been raised to value people over possessions, relationships over achievements, family connection over social status. Diego's behavior suggested that he operated from a completely different set of priorities. When it came time para dinner, Roberto had arranged for traditional family-style serving, con large platters of mole, pozole, carnitas, y chiles rellenos placed in cada table para everyone to share. Es una custom que emphasized community, generosity, y the pleasure of shared meals. Roberto was seated at the head table con los newlyweds, both sets of parents, y the padrinos de boda. He watched as Diego approached the communal serving style with visible discomfort, clearly accustomed to individual plated meals and formal dining protocols. "Diego," Roberto offered, "try the mole. Elena has been making it the same way for 30 years. It's practically legendary en el barrio." "Thank you, Roberto. I'm sure it's delicious." But Roberto noticed que Diego took only small, polite portions of each dish, eating carefully without enthusiasm. When Elena approached the table to personally serve Diego más mole, he politely declined, saying he was watching his carb intake. He needed to maintain his energy levels para their honeymoon travel tomorrow. Elena's face showed a flash of hurt, because she quickly concealed. In Mexican culture, refusing food prepared with love by family members was más than just dietary preference. It was a subtle rejection of hospitality, care, cultural tradition. "Diego," Paloma said softly, "Elena spent all day making this mole. She started at 5 this morning. And I appreciate that, really. It's just that I have specific dietary requirements." "Since when?" Paloma's question came out more sharply than Roberto had ever heard her speak to Diego. "You've eaten Elena's cooking before. You said you loved it." Diego's face flushed slightly. "I do love it, mi amor. Today is different. I need to be careful about what I eat before we travel tomorrow." The explanation sounded reasonable, pero Roberto could see in Paloma's eyes that she was beginning to notice patterns that had previously escaped her attention. Diego's dietary requirements seemed to appear whenever he was in situations that required him to fully embrace Roberto's family's traditions and culture. During the toasts, Roberto had prepared heartfelt words about entrusting his precious daughter to a man who would love and protect her, as Esperanza would have wanted. But as he stood to speak, he found himself struggling to deliver remarks that no longer felt entirely honest. "Family, my friends," he began, his voice carrying across El Patio, now illuminated by string lights and paper lanterns. "Today we celebrate not just la unión de Paloma y Diego, but the joining of two families." He paused, looking out at the faces gathered around tables that represented decades of relationships, shared struggles, celebrations, losses. "Paloma," Roberto continued, his eyes finding his daughter at the head table. "Your mother, Yo, raised you to be strong, independent, true to yourself. We taught you to value honesty, compassion, family above all else." Paloma's eyes filled with tears as Roberto spoke about Esperanza, about the values that had shaped their household, about the importance of finding a partner who would cherish those same principles. "Y Diego," Roberto said, turning his attention to his new son-in-law, "we welcome you into our family with open hearts, hoping that you will love, honor Paloma, not just as she is today, but as she grows and changes throughout los años que come." It was a beautiful toast, perfectly appropriate para la ocasión. But Roberto noticed that Diego's applause was somewhat perfunctory, and that during Roberto's most emotional references to Esperanza y family values, Diego had been glancing at his watch. After dinner, cuando la dancing began in earnest, Roberto found himself observing more than participating. He watched Paloma dance con various family members, her cousins, her uncles, elderly relatives, who moved slowly pero with great joy at being included en la celebration. Diego, meanwhile, danced primarily con Paloma y members of his own family. When Paloma tried to introduce him to her childhood friends from El neighborhood, Diego was polite pero distant, clearly marking time until he could return to conversations with people from his own social circle. The final straw came near midnight, durante what should have been one of the most meaningful moments of la celebración. Roberto's family had a tradition donde los recién casados received bendiciones from every elder present, with each older family member offering advice, prayers, or good wishes para el matrimonio. Tía Esperanza, despite her earlier fall, had insisted on participating in la tradition. Supported by Elena y another cousin, she made her way slowly toward the head table where Diego y Paloma were seated. Roberto watched as Tía Esperanza approached, carrying a small wrapped gift that she had obviously prepared with great care. Her steps were careful pero determined, her face glowing con la joy de being able to offer her bendición to Paloma. And Roberto saw Diego's face cuando he realized que Tía Esperanza was coming toward them. Instead of standing to greet her with respect, instead of helping her reach the table safely, Diego remained seated. I actually shifted his chair backward, as si creating distance between himself y la elderly woman. It was Paloma quien stood immediately, moving to help Tía Esperanza, y accepting her gift with tears of gratitude. It was Paloma quien knelt beside her great-aunt's chair to receive her whispered bendición. It was Paloma quien ensured que Tía Esperanza felt honored y appreciated during her moment of offering love to la nueva pareja. Diego simply sat there, smiling politely, pero making no effort to engage meaningfully con la tradición, con Tía Esperanza, or con la cultural significance of what was happening. In that moment, Roberto understood with crystal clarity what had been bothering him about Diego from the beginning. It wasn't just cultural differences or social class distinctions. It was fundamental disrespect para everything que Paloma had been raised to value: family connection, cultural tradition, care para los vulnerables, y genuine engagement con la community that had shaped her. Diego saw all of these things as quaint obstacles to be endured rather than treasures to be embraced. And if he felt that way about Paloma's cultural heritage, her family traditions, her beloved relatives, how could he truly love and honor Paloma herself? Roberto realized that the chair incident had been más than just carelessness. It had been a revelation of Diego's true character, a glimpse into how he would treat Paloma's family, eventually Paloma herself. Cuando la honeymoon period ended, real life required sustained effort and genuine care. As midnight approached and the celebration began winding down, Roberto made a decision that would have seemed impossible 12 hours earlier. He needed to have a serious conversation con Paloma before she left para her luna de miel, before she moved forward con a marriage que he now believed would ultimately break her heart. The question was whether his daughter would listen to warnings about the man she had just married, or whether her love would blind her to the red flags que had become impossible para Roberto to ignore. In either case, Roberto knew que the most difficult conversation of his life was still ahead, and that the beautiful wedding day that had begun with such hope was ending con doubts que might prove prophetic. Eran las 2 de la madrugada cuando los últimos invitados se marcharon, dejando el patio de Roberto lleno de platos sucios, copas vacías, y los restos de what had been a beautiful celebration just hours before. Paloma había cambiado su vestido de recepción por unos jeans y una blusa cómoda para ayudar con la limpieza, una decisión que había surprised y clearly irritated a Diego, quien esperaba que ella mantuviera su bridal elegance until the very end of la noche. Roberto estaba apilando sillas mientras watched a Diego checking his phone por quinta vez en 10 minutos, clearly impatient para leave y begin their honeymoon trip to Cancún. El plan era partir para el aeropuerto at 6 in the morning, which meant que Paloma y Diego tenían apenas 4 horas para sleep before beginning their new life as esposos casados. Paloma, mi amor, Diego said, approaching his new wife who was helping Elena pack leftover food para distribution among elderly relatives. Perhaps we should head to El Hotel now. We have an early flight. I want you to be rested para tomorrow. Paloma looked up from the container of mold she was sealing. I just want to help Papa clean up a little. This is my family home, Diego. I can't just leave todo el desastre para him to handle alone. But we hired people para clean up. The catering company will send someone mañana por la mañana to collect their equipment y restore everything to normal. Roberto could see la frustración growing in Diego's voice. Para él, the practical solution was obvious. Pay other people to handle menial tasks so that the principals could focus on more important concerns. But para Paloma, helping clean up after her own wedding reception was a matter of respect, why responsibility, not a task to be delegated. Diego, it'll just take another hour, Paloma said, her voice showing the first signs of strain que Roberto had heard from her all day. These people spent all day celebrating con us. The least we can do is help restore their space. Their space? Diego's eyebrows rose. Paloma, this is your father's house. He's perfectly capable of managing the cleanup. Oh, hiring people to do it professionally. Roberto felt his jaw tighten at Diego's dismissive tone. Pero said nothing. Elena, however, had no such restraint. Diego, Elena said, her voice carrying the authority que had made her an effective school principal for 3 decades. En esta family, we take care of each other. When someone makes a celebration para us, we don't just walk away from la mess afterward. Diego's face flushed, clearly unused to being corrected by anyone, much less by an older woman he considered socially inferior. Por supuesto, Elena. I understand family responsibility. I just think there are more efficient ways to handle these situations. Efficient for who? Elena's question was pointed. Para you, because you want to avoid trabajo físico? Or para la family, because we actually care about each other's well-being? The tension in el patio suddenly became palpable. Roberto could see que Diego was struggling to maintain his composure in the face of Elena's direct challenge to his priorities and character. Elena, I think everyone's tired, Roberto intervened, trying to prevent la situation from escalating into a full confrontation on Paloma's wedding night. Why don't you y las tías go home? Paloma, Diego, yo can handle the rest. Elena shot Roberto a look que clearly said she wasn't finished con Diego, pero she respected Roberto's request. She kissed Paloma goodnight, pointedly ignored Diego, and began gathering her purse and the containers of leftover food she was taking home. As Elena prepared to leave, she pulled Roberto aside. Roberto, we need to talk mañana. There are things about today that need to be discussed. Roberto nodded, understanding que Elena had observed the same troubling patterns he had been accumulating in his own mind throughout la celebration. Once Elena y los other family members had departed, el patio fell into an uncomfortable quiet. Paloma continued stacking plates while Diego stood near la door, clearly eager to leave, pero unwilling to simply abandon his new wife to manual labor. Mija, Roberto said, approaching Paloma. Diego has a point about el early flight. Why don't you go get some rest? I can finish this. Paloma paused in her cleaning, looking around el patio que had been the site of her wedding celebration. Roberto could see in her face that she was struggling con competing desires. The practical need para rest before travel, the emotional need to care para her father's home después de such an important event, the growing awareness that her new husband's priorities might not align con her own. Paloma, Diego said, his voice taking on a slight edge of command, we really do need to go. I've already confirmed our morning flight. Why, if we're late to el aeropuerto because we stayed up all night cleaning dishes, it will affect our entire itinerary. Roberto noticed that Diego had said, our morning flight, pero if we're late, subtly placing responsibility para any travel problems on Paloma's decision to help con la limpieza rather than on his own impatience. You go ahead to el hotel, Diego, Paloma said, her voice steady pero firm. I'll take a taxi después de helping Papa. We can meet at el aeropuerto in la morning. Diego's face showed shock. In all their time together, Paloma had never directly contradicted his wishes or chosen family obligations over his preferences. Paloma, that's ridiculous. We're married now. We should be together, especially on our wedding night. We will be together, just not right this second. Paloma returned to stacking dishes, her movements efficient, pero tense. Roberto could see that they were approaching a moment of truth that would define early patterns on their marriage. Would Diego accept Paloma's decision to fulfill what she saw as family obligations? Or would he pressure her to prioritize his comfort over her own values? Fine, Diego said finally, his tone suggesting Kate was anything pero fine. But Paloma, this kind of impracticality is going to be a problem cuando we're traveling internationally. You can't just make decisions based on emotion sin, considering practical consequences. The word impracticality hung in the air like an insult. Diego had just characterized Paloma's desire to help her father as emotional irrationality rather than moral responsibility. Roberto felt his protective instincts flaring, pero before he could respond, Paloma straightened up from her work. He looked directly at her new husband. Diego, caring about my family isn't impractical, it's essential. If you think helping my father clean up after my own wedding reception is unreasonable, then we have bigger problems than flight schedules. The confrontation Roberto had been dreading all day was finally beginning. Diego's mask of perfect courtesy was slipping, revealing the controlling why dismissive attitudes he had been lurking beneath his polished exterior. Paloma, I'm not saying you shouldn't care about tu familia. I'm saying there are appropriate times I places para different types of caring. Tonight, as newlyweds, our priority should be each other, not dishwashing. Why tomorrow morning, as we travel to our honeymoon, our priority will be each other. Right now, I want to make sure me papa isn't left alone. Can all this work after giving me the most beautiful wedding day I could have imagined? Roberto felt a surge of pride at his daughter's words, pero también a deep concern about the marital conflict that was emerging just hours after their wedding ceremony. Diego walked to the center of el patio, his movements sharp con frustration. Paloma, you need to understand something. I accepted this traditional approach para la wedding because I knew it was important to you and your family. But going forward, we need to make decisions based on logic y efficiency, not on outdated cultural expectations. The phrase outdated cultural expectations hit Roberto like a slap. Diego was talking about the values que had shaped Paloma's entire life, the traditions que connected her to her mother's memory, the family bonds que had sustained her through Esperanza's illness and death. What exactly do you consider outdated? Paloma's voice was quiet, pero Roberto could hear steel underneath her calm tone. Diego seemed to recognize that he had ventured into dangerous territory, pero instead of retreating, he doubled down. I think we need to create our own traditions as a family, traditions based on our education, our professional goals, our place in el modern world. Not on, he gestured around el patio, this kind of small-town, insular thinking. Roberto felt his hands clenching into fists. Diego had just dismissed not only Paloma's cultural heritage, pero también her choice to work as a teacher in her local community, her commitment to her extended family, her connection to the neighborhood que had raised her. Small-town, insular thinking, Paloma repeated slowly. Is that how you see mi familia? My work, my life? I see unlimited potential, Paloma. I see a brilliant woman who could be doing international work, traveling el mundo, making a real impact on a global scale instead of limiting herself to... Diego paused, clearly searching para a diplomatic way to phrase his thoughts. Instead of limiting myself to what? Instead of limiting yourself to being a teacher en una escuela pública en Tlaquepaque, cuando you could be working at international schools, consulting on educational policy, building a career que matches your intelligence y capabilities. Roberto understood now why Mauricio had approached him about Dubai. This wasn't about a single job opportunity. This was about Diego's fundamental belief que Paloma needed to be rescued from her own choices, elevated from her provincial life to something más worthy of his social status y ambitions. Diego, Paloma said, setting down the plates she had been stacking, I love being a teacher en mi escuela. I love my students, my colleagues, my work. Is not a limitation, as a choice. But as a choice based on limited exposure to alternatives. Paloma, you've never lived anywhere else, never worked in different educational systems, never experienced what the world has to offer. Do you think that invalidates my ability to choose what makes me happy? Diego ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, his composure finally beginning to crack under the pressure of having to articulate beliefs he had never expected to defend. I think you deserve better than this, he said, gesturing around el patio. Better than small-town gossipy family drama y provincial limitations. I think you deserve a life que matches your beauty y intelligence y potential. Roberto realized that Diego's vision of better involved removing Paloma from everything that had shaped her character, values, identity. He wanted to improve her by isolating her from her support system, by substituting his judgment para her own. "Why, if I don't want to be improved," Paloma asked, "then you're settling para less than you deserve." The arrogance in Diego's response finally pushed Roberto past his limit. "Diego, con respeto, my daughter isn't settling para anything. She's choosing to build a life based on values que tu apparently don't understand or appreciate." Diego turned to face Roberto, his expression showing frustration at being challenged by someone he had expected to remain deferential. "Roberto, I respect your values. But I also want más para Paloma than a life spent teaching other people's children in una neighborhood que offers no opportunities para growth or advancement. What about the life she wants para herself? I think Paloma wants more than she realizes. I think her exposure has been limited by circumstances. Once she experiences alternatives, she'll understand what I'm offering her." Roberto felt sick, realizing que Diego saw their marriage not as a partnership between equals, pero as his project to remake Paloma into someone who would fit his vision of an appropriate wife. "Diego," Paloma said, her voice very quiet, "do you love me as I am, or do you love who you think I could become?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Roberto could see que Diego was struggling to formulate a response que wouldn't reveal the full extent of his conditional regard para Paloma. "I love you, Paloma, completely. I just want us to build the best life possible together. I think that means being open to opportunities que might take us beyond what you've known before." It was a politician's answer, technically responsive pero fundamentally evasive. Roberto could see in Paloma's face que she had recognized the non-answer para what it was. "What if the best life para me is the one I'm already living, with some additions like a loving husband, maybe children someday, pero fundamentally based aquí, con mi family, y mi work, y my community?" Diego's silence was telling. He had never seriously considered que Paloma might genuinely prefer her current life to his alternatives. "Diego," Roberto said, "can you answer my daughter's question? Do you love her as she is, aquí, now, with her current job, you values, commitments?" Diego looked between Roberto and Paloma, clearly recognizing que his response would define their relationship going forward. "I love Paloma. I think love means wanting the best para the person you care about, even if they don't initially see the possibilities themselves." Roberto felt his heart breaking para his daughter. Diego had just confirmed que his love was conditional on Paloma's willingness to abandon her identity. "I accept his vision of improvement." "Diego," Paloma said softly, "what if your version of the best isn't what I want? What if it means giving up things que are essential to who I am? Then we'll figure out compromises." "What kind of compromises?" Diego was quiet para a long moment, clearly realizing que any specific answer would reveal more about his expectations than he wanted to admit. "We can visit your family regularly. We can come back para holidays. You can stay connected to your culture while still experiencing new opportunities." Roberto understood que Diego was describing a scenario donde Paloma would become a tourist in her own life, visiting her real identity occasionally, while living primarily according to his preferences, ambitions. "If I don't want that compromise?" Diego's frustration finally boiled over. "Then you're choosing to limit yourself based on fear, familiarity, instead of courage, growth." The accusation que Paloma was motivated by fear rather than love, by provincialism rather than authentic preference, revealed everything Roberto needed to know about Diego's respect para his daughter's autonomy, judgment. "Diego," Roberto said, his voice steady despite his anger, "my daughter isn't afraid of el mundo. She's choosing what makes her happy. As you who seems afraid que you married someone whose values don't match your ambitions." Diego's face flushed. "Roberto, con respeto. This is between Paloma y me. No, Diego. When you dismiss my daughter's choices as fear y ignorance, when you describe her life's work as beneath her, when you treat her family and culture as obstacles to overcome, you make it about all of us. Roberto turned to Paloma, who was standing very still in the middle of el patio, her wedding makeup smeared con tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. Mija, whatever you decide about to marriage, know que your life here, your work, your values, your choices, they're not limitations, they're strengths. They're what made you into the woman any man should feel honored to love exactly as you are. Paloma looked at Roberto, then at Diego, clearly struggling to process the implications of everything que had been revealed durante this late-night confrontation. I need to think, she said finally. Diego, I need some time to understand what we're really talking about here. What we're talking about, Diego said, his voice tight con controlled frustration, is building a life together. But that requires both of us to be open to new possibilities. Oh, it requires both of us to respect each other's fundamental values, Paloma responded. Roberto could see que they had reached an impasse que wouldn't be resolved tonight. But he también could see que seeds of doubt had been planted in Paloma's mind, doubts about whether Diego truly loved her or only loved his vision of what she could become. As dawn approached over Guadalajara, Roberto realized que his daughter's wedding day had ended con more questions than answers, y que the marriage que had begun con such hope was already facing challenges que might prove insurmountable. The question was whether love, real, unconditional love, could survive the fundamental incompatibility between Diego's need to improve Paloma y Paloma's right to be loved exactly as she was. Roberto estaba en su taller de carpintería, lijando cuidadosamente la superficie de una cuna que había estado construyendo durante las últimas semanas, cuando escuchó el sonido familiar del Honda Civic de Paloma, estacionándose en el callejón detrás de su casa. Era martes por la tarde, su día habitual de visita desde que había regresado de Dubái hace 3 meses. El matrimonio había durado exactamente 90 días. Diego había convencido a Paloma de acompañarlo a Dubái solo por 1 año para ver si les gustaba la experiencia internacional. Pero lo que había comenzado como un experimento de corto plazo rápidamente se había convertido en una Battle of Wills sobre el futuro fundamental de sus vidas juntas. Roberto alzó la vista cuando Paloma entró al taller, notando inmediatamente the glow que había estado observando durante las últimas semanas. A los 29 años, su hija se veía más radiante y tranquila de lo que había estado desde antes de conocer a Diego. Hola, papá, Paloma dijo, acercándose a examinar su trabajo en la cuna. ¿Es para los Martínez? Roberto asintió, sonriendo mientras observaba las manos de Paloma tracing the smooth curves que había estado perfeccionando. Los Martínez eran vecinos de toda la vida que esperaban su primer bebé, y Roberto había insistido en hacer la cuna como regalo, refusing payment despite their protests. Papá, Paloma dijo, her voice carrying a note que Roberto had learned to recognize over the months since her return. Tengo noticias. Roberto set down his sandpaper, giving Paloma his complete attention. Durante los últimos 3 meses, their Tuesday conversations had become a routine that both treasured, time para reconnect, para healing, y para honest discussion about the lessons learned desde el día de la boda que había revealed so much about human nature y priorities. ¿Qué tipo de noticias, mija? Paloma smiled, the expression transforming her face con pure joy. El tipo de noticias que hace que esa cuna sea perfect timing. Roberto felt his heart skip. ¿Estás pregnant? Sí. 10 semanas. Roberto dropped his tools. He pulled Paloma into a hug que lifted her off her feet, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously. After so much pain and disappointment, after the heartbreak of watching his daughter's marriage collapse, her struggle to rebuild her sense of self, this news felt like a gift from Esperanza herself. "Y Javier?" Roberto asked, referring to the mathematics teacher from Paloma's school, Quien had been quietly supporting her since her return from Dubai. "Over the moon, nervous pero thrilled. We've been talking about getting married before El Bebé arrives, pero—" Paloma paused, her expression growing more serious. "We wanted to talk to you first." Roberto understood. After the disaster con Diego, Paloma had become more cautious about major life decisions, more aware of the importance of family approval and support. Javier Morales was everything Diego hadn't been: humble, genuine, deeply committed to his work, con underprivileged students. We completely devoted to Paloma exactly as she was. "Mija, Javier has been parte de nuestra familia since you were children. Seeing you two together these past months is como watching puzzle pieces finally fit where they belong." Roberto's relationship con Javier went back 15 years, to cuando Javier had been one of Paloma's students, Roberto had helped him build a small workshop donde he could teach woodworking to at-risk teenagers. Javier understood the values que had shaped Paloma, respected her work. He had never once suggested that she needed to be improved or rescued from her choices. "Tell me what happened in Dubai," Roberto said, leading Paloma to the wooden bench he had built near the window donde afternoon light made detailed work possible. Over the months since her return, Paloma had shared pieces of her Dubai experience, pero never the complete story. Roberto understood that she had needed time to process the emotional complexity of her marriage's failure, her own part, and its demise. "Diego got the position he wanted," Paloma began, her voice steady pero reflective. "A major architectural project designing luxury resorts throughout the Middle East. It's exactly what he had dreamed about: high-profile work, international recognition, the opportunity to make his mark on a global scale." Roberto waited, knowing there was more. "I got a job at an international school that paid 3 times what I earned a key. The facilities were incredible, the resources unlimited, the students bright why motivated." "But?" Paloma was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. "But I missed my students here. I missed working con children who needed education, not just para intellectual growth, pero para hope, para possibilities they couldn't see in their daily lives. In Dubai, I was teaching children who already had every advantage. It's meaningful work, pero not the work que fills my soul." Roberto nodded, understanding how Paloma's sense of purpose was tied to serving those who needed her most, not those who could pay the most para her services. "Y Diego, como reacted when you told him how you felt?" "He said I was being naive, that I was romanticizing poverty as struggle instead of appreciating the opportunity to make a real impact con students who could actually benefit from high-quality education." Roberto felt familiar anger at Diego's dismissive attitude toward Paloma's professional calling, pero kept his expression neutral to encourage her to continue. He also said que missing home was natural at first, pero that I needed to commit to building our new life instead of looking backward toward outdated attachments. The phrase, outdated attachments, stung Roberto personally, since he understood that Categoria included him, Elena, Tia Esperanza, and everyone else Paloma loved. "How did you respond?" "I told him que love isn't an outdated attachment. I told him que caring about my community isn't naive romanticism. I told him que if he couldn't understand why I wanted to come home para my students and my family, then he didn't understand me at all." Roberto felt proud of his daughter's clarity and self-advocacy, qualities que had been temporarily overshadowed by her love para Diego, pero had never disappeared. What did Diego say to that? Paloma's expression grew sad, though not with the devastating heartbreak Kay had characterized her early weeks after leaving Dubai. He said, "Kay, if I chose my provincial life over our marriage, I was the one who was ending it, that he had offered me the world. If I preferred my small corner of Guadalajara, then we wanted fundamentally different things from life." Roberto could see que Diego's response had been calculated to make Paloma feel guilty para prioritizing her own happiness over his vision of their future together. "And that's when you knew," Roberto said, understanding the moment of clarity his daughter must have experienced. "See, Papa, that's when I realized that Diego had never wanted to marry me. He had wanted to marry the woman he thought he could turn me into. Yeah, I finally understood that trying to become that woman would mean losing everything that makes me who I am." Paloma stood and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where she had grown up, where she had chosen to return, where she was now planning to raise her own child. The hardest part wasn't leaving Diego. The hardest part was admitting que you, Elena, Tia Esperanza, everyone who loved me, had seen something I was blind to. Diego's disrespect at the wedding wasn't an aberration, it was a preview. Roberto joined his daughter at the window, watching children play soccer in the street while their mothers chatted in doorways. It was a scene que had repeated itself for generations in their neighborhood, a symbol of continuity, community, the simple pleasures que Diego had never learned to value. "Mia, love sometimes makes us hope we can change people who don't want to be changed. It's not blindness, it's optimism. But wisdom means knowing when that optimism needs to give way to reality." Paloma leaned against Roberto's shoulder, a gesture que reminded him of when she was small. I would come to him with problems that seemed insurmountable at the time, pero were ultimately solvable with patience y love. "Javier wants to have the wedding here, in the same place Diego y I were married. He says he wants to replace bad memories with good ones, wants to claim that space para our real love instead of letting it remain haunted by my mistake." Roberto smiled, appreciating both Javier's wisdom and his courage. Many men would have wanted to create entirely new venues, new traditions, new everything, to distance themselves from their partner's previous relationship. But Javier understood that healing sometimes required facing difficult places, transforming them. "Y tú qué piensas?" "I think he's right. I think Mama would want me to reclaim that space, to fill it with the kind of love you had, instead of letting Diego's contempt define it forever." Roberto felt tears starting as Paloma mentioned Esperanza. His late wife had loved this house, this patio, this community with the same depth and authenticity que Paloma had inherited. The idea of Paloma marrying someone who truly understood and cherished those values, in the same space where she had first married someone who had dismissed them, felt like a form of justice. "When are you thinking?" "Soon. Before I start showing too much, but after we've had time to plan something beautiful. Maybe Christmas season? Early December?" Roberto nodded, already mentally planning the modifications he would make to the patio, the flowers he would plant, the improvements que would make the space even more perfect para Paloma's second wedding. "Papa, hey, something else I need to tell you." Roberto heard the change in Paloma's tone. He prepared himself para whatever serious conversation was coming. "Diego called last week." Roberto felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. They had had no contact with Diego since Paloma's return to Guadalajara, yet Roberto had hoped never to hear from him again. What did he want? To tell me que he had been promoted again, que his Dubai project was being featured in international architecture magazines, que he was being recruited by firms in London and New York. Roberto waited, sensing there was more. Why, to tell me que if I ever came to my senses he wanted the life he could provide, his offer was still open. The arrogance of the statement, Diego's assumption que Paloma was suffering in Guadalajara, he would eventually realize her mistake, made Roberto's blood pressure rise. "How did you respond?" Paloma smiled. Roberto could see genuine amusement in her expression, instead of the pain que Diego's name had previously evoked. "I told him I was pregnant. Why engaged? Why teaching at the same school he had dismissed as beneath me? Why that I had never been happier in my life?" "¿Y él qué dijo?" "He was silent para a long moment. Then he said que I was wasting my life, y that when the novelty wore off, y I realized what I had given up, I would regret choosing mediocrity over excellence." Roberto felt rage building at Diego's continued disrespect para Paloma's choices, pero also recognition que Diego's inability to understand genuine happiness meant he would probably never find it himself. Then, Paloma continued, "I said something I had been wanting to say for months. Que le dijiste? I told him que mediocrity wasn't measured by salary or prestige or international recognition. I told him que mediocrity was being unable to love someone exactly as they are, being unable to appreciate the beauty in ordinary human connections, being unable to find joy in serving something bigger than your own ambition." Roberto felt immense pride at his daughter's articulation of values que had shaped their family for generations. "I told him que if that was mediocrity, I choose it over his version of excellence every single time." "¿Y cómo terminó la conversación?" He hung up, y I realized que for the first time since I met him, I felt sorry para Diego instead of inadequate around him. Roberto understood que Paloma had achieved the ultimate victory over Diego's manipulation. She had reached a point where his judgment of her life no longer had the power to cause self-doubt. As they continued talking about wedding plans, baby preparations, the future que Paloma was building con Javier, Roberto reflected on the lessons of the past year. Diego's contempt para their family values, his dismissal of Paloma's work, his inability to appreciate the depth, beauty of their cultural traditions. All of it had ultimately served to clarify what really mattered. "Papa," Paloma said as their conversation wound down, "I want to ask you something important. Por supuesto, mija. When Javier and I get married, would you build us something? Not furniture or decoración, but something that represents what we learned from my first marriage, what we want to do differently." Roberto considered the request, understanding que Paloma was asking para something symbolic, something que would serve as a reminder of hard-won wisdom. "What did you have in mind?" "A family altar. Something we can use to honor Mama's memory, to celebrate our traditions, to teach our children about the values que matter most. Something que makes it clear que our home will be built on respect para our heritage instead of embarrassment about it." Roberto felt his throat tighten con emotion. An altar para family values, para cultural pride, para the kind of love que celebrated rather than sought to improve. It was perfect. "It would be my honor, mija." Entonces, as afternoon faded into evening, father and daughter worked together in the workshop, Paloma helping Roberto apply finishing oil to the cuna, while they talked about names para the baby, plans para the wedding, dreams para the future. Roberto realized that the heartbreak of Paloma's first marriage had ultimately led to deeper happiness, clearer values, stronger family bonds. Diego's attempt to pull Paloma away from everything she loved had instead clarified how much those things meant to her. 6 months ago, Roberto had watched his daughter marry a man who saw her as a project to be improved. Now he was preparing to celebrate her marriage to a man who saw her as a treasure to be cherished exactly as she was. The difference between those two forms of love made all the heartbreak worthwhile. Epílogo. Nuevos comienzos. 2 años después, Roberto estaba en su patio, ahora lleno una vez más con familia y amigos, celebrando el primer cumpleaños de su nieto, Diego Roberto Morales Mendoza, named para the strength to overcome challenges y the wisdom to choose love over pride. Little Diego toddled between his parents, Javier y Paloma, both of whom watched their son con the relaxed joy to people who had built their happiness on solid foundations. Paloma había returned to her beloved school después de maternity leave, mientras que Javier had been promoted to principal, allowing them both to serve their community while building their family. Elena approached Roberto, carrying her traditional contribution of homemade flan. I settled beside him on the bench he had built specifically para watching grandchildren play in the patio. He had seen so much joy, I sorrow. Do you ever wonder what would have happened si Paloma hubiera stayed con Diego? Elena asked. Roberto considered the question while watching his grandson discover the joy of mariachi music, clapping his tiny hands y bouncing to the rhythm con pure delight. I think she would have survived, Roberto said finally. Paloma es fuerte como su madre, but I don't think she would have thrived. I don't think she would have become the woman she was meant to be. Elena nodded, understanding that sometimes the most difficult experiences lead to the most important growth. Y Diego, do you ever hear about him? Occasionally. Still in Dubai, still winning awards, still building impressive buildings. Roberto paused. I'm still single, according to Mauricio, when I see him at church. Elena made a sound that might have been sympathy or might have been justice. Some people never learn success without connection as just expensive loneliness. As evening approached, or the celebration continued, Roberto reflected on the lessons that the past years had taught him about love, family, why the courage required to protect what matters most. Sometimes being a good father meant supporting your child's choices even when you had doubts, but sometimes it meant trusting your instincts about people who didn't deserve the treasure of your child's love. The chair incident at Paloma's first wedding had been more than careless behavior. It had been a revelation of character. Diego's inability to see Tia Esperanza as worthy of consideration had predicted his inability to see Paloma as worthy of respect. But the real lesson wasn't about Diego's failures. The real lesson was about Paloma's strength, her clarity about her own values, her courage to choose authentic happiness over impressive alternatives. As Roberto watched his daughter dance con her husband while their son clapped from his grandfather's arms, he understood that the most beautiful wedding gifts aren't found in stores. They're found in wisdom, earned through experience, and love that deepens instead of demanding change, in families that celebrate each other exactly as they are. The mariachis began playing Las Golondrinas as the sun set over Tlaquepaque, y Roberto felt Esperanza's presence in the music, and the laughter, and the sight of their grandson taking his first dancing steps, con parents who would teach him que love means acceptance, community means support. A family means never having to apologize for who you are. Sometimes the most important moments begin con someone pulling away a chair when you need support. But they end con finding people who will always make sure you have a safe place to land.